that state of Kansas is named after, sort of. And the framework out of poles and all that. Pueblo, one of the most common green building styles throughout the world. Adobe, also called cob, mixture of clay, sand, and some plant fibers, and it's one of the strongest and the best insulation you can find anywhere, and you can build them partially underground or above ground, and you're set for winter, summer, cold weather, warm, and plenty of room. Some of their, this is Kasina in Ghana, northern Ghana, up a little closer to the Sahara, and painted clay adobe. The step ladder, I should have brought in a copy of the shoe swap in the east of the Cascade Mountains, notched log step ladder. Same thing over in Ghana. Okay. And people who live in adobe pueblos often like to hang out on their roofs and dry their fruit or whatever up there and play games and tell stories. The old way, that old way of 5,000 plus years ago, the people that are still living that way, that have their land base and their traditions, we finally had some objective anthropologists observe accurately how many hours a week would you have to work to live in the old traditional way if you had your land base and everything intact. And there is Richard Lee, Marshall Salins, some other anthropologists of the 1960s and early 70s who observed indigenous people of northern Australia away from all of the towns and civilization, which are on the 3 other coasts in Australia, and in some Arctic Inupiat at the time in the 60s, where they were still pretty close to the original way. And then a few other places, isolated Philippine Islands people still live in the traditional way. And they calculated that to have everything they needed, food, shelter, all of the basics, they had a 15 to 20 hour average work week. If you average in all of the work done through the whole year, you have your real busy seasons where you're gathering food and drying it and storing it. And then the winters where you're telling stories and joking around and having cultural and prayer activities. And you average it all in 15 to 20 hours a week. What would you do with that? Have everything you need? No need for money? Oh, does that sound impossible? Where are you coming from? Dreamland? I heard you grew up in La La Land. Well, I didn't take to it. I left when I was 18. Crazy city. Okay, well, we're getting rolling here. Okay. Adobe's dugout canoes, again in Benin, and I did not find the name of this tribe, but very similar to our Wampanoag dugout canoes, which people have been reviving the building of those in the last 20 years or so. They started with the small, more like this size, and now just in the last couple of years, the big ones that can get a whole bunch of people. And you see the pictures of us, the different branches of the Wampanoag Nation, Mashpee, Assonet, Kootenai, and Pokanoket, and there's only about 20 to 30 Pokanoket Wampanoags left that I know. You know, they're probably out there, but they don't identify. You know, and we're obviously to different degrees, and some not. You know, mixed with African people. There's a lot of history about that, a lot of survival history in the colonial era. Where now you know they had African slaves in all 13 colonies. Here, I'll put a couple more pictures up while I'm talking. A lot of people don't know this. They always think, oh, slavery, that was a southern thing. No, all up and down the East Coast, there is slavery. It just so happens that largely due to the moral preaching of Quakers and other anti-slavery activists, the northern colonies, when they became states during the Revolution, outlawed slavery. And they were the majority of the population of the new nation of the United States. The Southerners, who had become much more wealthy with their slave owners. And we're only talking about the slave owners in the South always were between 10 to 4%, the smaller number as you get closer to the Civil War. And you got some kind of image, probably a lot of you in your mind, oh, everybody in the South, all the white folks were slave owners. You know, but there was an elite enterprise, and everybody else was subject to these lords of the cotton world. You know, not just their slaves, but the entire Southern societies, and oppressed in many different ways. Okay, I didn't plan to talk about that. I gotta get going. All right, here. So in the poster that you saw this painting, and I want to preface this with, I'm skipping a lot of history, but what I'm skipping is just that when slavery ended in the North, many of the former slaves, instead of just joining Anglo-American society, went and lived in nations, tribal nations like the Wampanoag and the Pequots and the Narragansetts and the Powhatan Confederacy tribes, Rappahannock and others of Virginia, and all up and down the coast, you know, and down in the southeast during the colonial era. And this is kind of a segue into what I'm going to talk about with the Seminole Nation here, is the Muskogean peoples. The Muskogees, the people called the Creeks, because the English didn't want to learn how to say Muskogee. You know, oh, the people who live by the creeks. What's that all about? Okay. But they're very smart. We just don't want to say Muskogee. We want to use the easy word. Okay, they're so smart. All right. Anyway, their homelands were in northern Georgia and a little ways into Alabama and in central Georgia. And they would bust into the plantations in South Carolina and set people free to rebuild their populations from the diseases that these folks had brought. The poxes, the measles, the plagues, bubonic plague, and all of that was before smallpox became the biggest disease. There were a lot of these foreign viruses that were reducing native populations and beginning on the East Coast. And so part of the strategy, the survival strategy, and as you saw in the images I just showed you of indigenous African tribes, almost instantly the Africans and the natives realize we've got a lot more in common with each other than we do with these forceful colonialist people who are taking over this land, these aggressive, predatory people. And so it became natural then for when people did escape from slavery to seek refuge in indigenous communities. The Europeans caught on to that real quick and began the age-old process of colonialist aggression and domination called divide and conquer. And one of the manifestations of that was to hire native people to recapture escaped African slaves, or to use Africans to help them militarily against native people. Those are a couple of the big ones, and there are other ways. And then they would just tell them terrible, mythical stories about each other, tell the natives horrible things about Africans, tell the Africans horrible things about natives and try to get them scared of each other. That's it throughout the literature. You can see all these, and of course cannibalism is one of the big ones they try to use for people who really weren't cannibalistic, and they perpetuated that myth so much that a lot of people started believing it. Okay, so we come then into the 19th century. One of the forms of resistance, of course, is warfare, you know, and as the European and Euro-American population becomes so large, physical warfare became more and more futile, but it happened, and especially in the early part of that century, the Seminole people, who were a breakaway from the Muskogees, and they moved further south into southern Georgia and eventually Florida to get away from not only the English colonialists, but the Spanish who were still present there. And many escaped African slaves, mostly from South Carolina and Georgia, joined them. You're going to hear all kinds of disputed numbers, partly from Seminoles who've been conditioned and trained to be ashamed of the African ancestry and connections. There's plenty of them, both in Georgia and Florida, but others that don't have that baggage too. You know, I don't want to paint them all with a broad stroke, but I've run into all kinds. And but considerable, because it's in all of the war records. They had Negroes, is one of the politer words they used, fighting with the Indians against us. We couldn't stop them. There were 3 Seminole wars against the U.S. By this time to stay in their Florida homelands. The second one that I'm going to talk about here was after the Indian Removal Act, the forced exile of 1830. And so in the late 1830s, the Seminoles of Florida were fighting to stay in what was left of their homelands there in Florida. Some of them were captured and sent to Oklahoma. That's why you have Oklahoma Seminoles and Florida Seminoles. I bet you already know all that. Okay, I'm just making sure, checking in there, just checking in. Okay, and the Army defeated the U.S. because most of them did not get captured and they stayed in their lands, and that's where their reservations or their remnant community reservations are to this day, where they insisted on staying put. And the stories of African and Seminole and then mixed Afro-Seminole allies are many. This was one of the leading African Seminoles. Now you'll also hear some Seminoles say, well, we always kept separate. We lived together in the same community and we always kept separate. Didn't intermarry and all of that stuff. Baggage, you know. And but they did, and I'll show you some photos, you know. And the United States had such a hard time trying to defeat the Seminole Nation in the Second War. They spent $20 million, which is a lot more they spent for that bogus Louisiana Purchase. You know all about that. They put some marks on the piece of paper and say, now we all own the whole American plains. You know, that one was $15 million, and they spent $20 million on soldiers and ammunition and whatnot, just trying to defeat the Seminole Nation, a few thousand warriors, you know. That's something. That's something to remember and be proud of, you know. Then there is the Third Seminole War. They tried again to relocate people to Indian Territory, Oklahoma, in the 1850s, about 20 years after the Second War. And this guy, Alligator Chief, or Halpuda Miko, also called Billy Bowlegs, was a warrior in the Second War and the Third. He was the war chief then. And again, they were not captured. They were not sent to Indian Territory and stayed, and that was the last time. After that, the U.S. said, okay, let them stay in the Everglades. We don't want to mess with those alligators anyway. And then much later, the Seminoles were wrestling alligators for tourist money and stuff like that. Okay, there you go. I could say more. And there's his grandson when he was young and when he was old, and some other Seminoles. And I don't, not in this lecture anyway. I'm not going to talk about who's mixed African and who isn't. I'll let the images speak for themselves, because there are people, in some of these families that deny they have African ancestry because someone taught them in a brainwashing system to be ashamed of that, American Afrophobia is a powerful force, and color phobia of all sorts. But there you go. And the neck beads, I was going to talk about an old Seminole tradition. And I don't say they got that from Africa. This is spontaneous. There are indigenous people around the world, China, India, South America, North America, and indigenous Africa, who have elaborate kind of a network of beads going up their necks like that. But I just thought it was an interesting similarity. And now the Maasai and Turkana people of Kenya, they were not among the people captured and brought to America. They're over in the east part of Africa. So there would have been no way for them to come over and influence the Seminole woman to put beads on their neck. That was an independent cultural practice. Now, Mumuila tribe of Angola, that's in the farthest southern part of the captured African people's territory, and they mostly went to Brazil, into the biggest slave market in the Americas. But some of them might have, spread. And the trade went all across the Western Hemisphere. You might have been captured and brought to Brazil, and you could still end up in the Caribbean or in North America eventually because of the trade extensions of the slave trade. So you see a possible connection there. Next intersection of activism, the abolitionist movement. How am I doing on time, somebody? What time is it?
11:10.
You can go longer if you need to.
Well, no, I don't want to.
You can if you want to.
Okay,
We kind of left a little.
okay, don't let me play too much, because I will play. Okay, I'm gonna get reined in here pretty soon. Okay, Frederick Douglass, who also happens to be of mixed Native and African ancestry, famous abolitionist. Among the many abolitionists who spoke out